Fundamentals of writing a research paper. See you back. Haven't seen you guys since last year. We have two main topics this morning we're going to cover. First of all, we're going to discuss how you write a paper from your detailed outline. And then secondly, we're just going to look at the basic format of arranging your paper. And we'll take time then to go over your outline at the end. I'll try to get at least one on video for those who are receiving this from a long distance. In the beginning here, there's several things to remember about writing your paper. For you, find an environment that helps you concentrate and think so that you can pay attention to what you're doing. At the point of writing, it's the intention of the project that your detailed outline is sufficient so that you're actually concentrating on connecting your thoughts in a meaningful fashion, like putting together a puzzle and getting all the little details in order so it makes sense. One important thing that you'll be doing that's not a part of your detailed outline per se is you'll be making sure you have opening and closing sentences to each of your paragraphs and pay attention to those so that there's proper clarity, transition, and smoothness as you go through. And I'll show you a couple samples as we go through here. And then just as a rule of hand, roughly, you should expect your paragraphs to be 4 to 8 sentences long. And that really depends on the substance of your content. I would say, though, in the big picture, your paragraphs should be somewhat the same. In other words, if you have, here and there really short paragraphs, and then once in a while you get a really long one, you might want to just look at the thought patterns there for structure and balance. So those are just some general introductory detail things, and you don't have a note for that. By the way, for the notes for this section, I printed off the overheads in full page form because when you reduce these to 6 to a page, it's impossible to read, and so it's useless. You'll have to kind of write on what's there. Hopefully you can fit all your notes in. Let's begin on your first document page. What we have here is a sample detailed outline, and we're going to take this sample detailed outline and sort of begin using it to turn the corner on writing the substance. So what I've identified here is the first segment. This little box will equal the content for the first paragraph. But I do want to make a note here. What you have is an actual student product, okay? It was actually what a student turned in. And there are some mistakes. Hopefully I can point the mistakes out to you. That's real helpful. But here is where there's not a mistake, but I'd like to clarify. Both in this line here and in this line here, these two main points are referenced. And she used what I call the rough draft reference system, which your detailed outline was allowed to use. You just use the card number, and it doesn't mean anything to the person reading it, but it means a lot to you. Now, when you're transferring this into the body of the paper and you're actually writing a paragraph, you change this reference from the rough draft style to the proper MLA, and I'll give a recap at the end of the lecture to just remind you what that is, but you'll use the proper MLA endnote here and so you'll translate this card into that proper form. Incidentally, this student had the endnotes in the detailed outline, and in this paragraph failed to transpose them onto the paper, so that was an error of the student. So as I go along, please also ask questions. I will try to repeat any questions. At least I'll try to give a clear answer. Okay, go ahead to the next page then. On the next page, what we have then is that little bit into the first paragraph. And I did want to point out that the MLA end references are missing from that paragraph, which is unfortunate. Let's go to the next page and just look a little bit at the details of this. What you actually have is a fairly short paragraph. If I count correctly, it's essentially got only 3 sentences. Now, in terms of actual grading of your paper, if you're having problem with the length of your paragraphs, it'll show up as a pattern. So when I review your paper, I'll not have the time to go over every page and mark every mistake. What I will have the time to do is take the first several pages and make very clear comments. But when I make a comment on your paper that your paragraphs are too short or they're too long, when I make that comment, you need to transpose that comment to your whole paper. I am not going to go through your whole paper and mark up every single paragraph. That's your responsibility to carry the critique to its proper application. But what we have here, the sentence that's underlined, is the core idea that came out of the outline, and she sort of combined two separate ideas into one more monolithic statement. There's nothing really wrong with the sentence per se. However, there are no endnotes, which is inappropriate. But then what you can notice here from this particular page is the introductory sentence here is both from the notes that she had in her detailed outline, but it's also written nicely to form an introductory sentence to the paragraph that draws your attention adequately. I'll probably try to mention this several times as I go through this student's work as a sample, but it's really important that you're thoughtful with what you're writing on paper. And your detailed outline should be just what it is, a detailed outline. But as you're changing your detailed outline into your flowing paper, you might want to start moving points around because of the logic and flow. So you're going to have full permission. There's nothing wrong at all if you pull out a part of that outline and move it to somewhere else because it fits there better. In fact, that's the expectation, that you would do that. It's really critical. Your paper has to read smoothly. Now, in the samples that we have here of the student's paper, there are some mistakes, but one of the chief things that I like about the student's work is it's very excellent when it comes to taking the ideas out of the outline and then putting them into a smooth flowing presentation of the information, and it's done quite effectively. So this is a nice introductory sentence, and then you have here at the end a separate sentence that's also transitional sentence. Well, if you go to the next page then, going back to the outline that this student was working from, there's an underlining here of the top sentence in the outline. Now this illustrates thoughtfulness on the student's part. This student took the first point that she had listed in her outline and thoughtfully plugged it in to the last position in the paper, of that paragraph. So here you have it taking position last when in the outline it was position first. Okay? Now that's thoughtfulness. That's the student thinking the concept through, what they had in mind. Here's where the student conceptualization comes through. I don't like this student's detailed outline that much. It's in my opinion, a little sloppy, a little careless. Sometimes instead of writing a complete sentence, she takes the time and just says, well, I'm going to say something about this. And she just kind of says, you know, about this. But as poor as the detailed outline was, it was significant information to her. And so she took some of those really crummy sentences in the detailed outline and transformed them into really meaningful flowing statements within the context of the paragraph. So what's more important to me? The end product. We're all a little different. The writing of your notes, the detailing of your outline, a lot of that has to do with a little bit of who you are and your skill level and what have you. And you know, I'll try to make sure that your outline is as good as possible for the benefit of your paper, but there's an aspect to which when it all is said and done, your paper needs to read in a meaningful and a clear fashion. And so we'll cover those issues as we go along, but this is just a simple yet pretty good example about carefulness. We have clarity, we have smoothness, we have flow, and you can tell the student is thinking through, I want to get my point across, and what's the best way to do it. Okay, let's go back to the outline again and look at another part of it. Moving down in the outline, we have the subpoint 2 now we're beginning to develop. The actual little red box should be encompassing A. I just got kind of accidentally clipped. Sorry about that. But what you have here, again, 4 points, which are going to become the substance of the next paragraph. And just just by way of your note taking, okay, because you're going to look at this later when you're working on your paper. If you look at these particular notes up here in the letter A outside the box, that's going to become the first sentence of her paragraph. And then look at point B. Point B is going to actually become the third sentence of the paragraph. And then point C is actually going to become the second sentence, and she's going to eliminate the rest of that from this particular section. And so what we have is, again, if you look at the detailed outline, she has points A through F, but when she actually gets into the process of assimilating, what does this information mean? How is it going to fit into the paper? She takes the time to reorder the sentence sequence and eliminate some of the information from this particular paragraph. So here's the final product of the paragraph. And I'm going to kind of use this for you to draw some arrows and make comments to. In this particular paragraph, first of all, the first sentence is both an introductory sentence, but it's also some content out of her outline. Again, because it's content, she should have had an MLA note. I think I have the end notes mentioned elsewhere, but she needs to have proper end notes. There is an example of a proper end note in here, and I want to draw attention to it because you're going to look at it and you're going to say, well, that's not what he said in class. Okay, here's a clarity on end notes. So you might want to tuck this away, make it real clear. The end note, at the end of this lecture, there's going to be a little statement to you what the end note needs to have. The last name of the author and the page number. That's the end note. There is an exception, and that is when you have an author that you have multiple individual books or articles from. And when you have an author with more than one article that you're referring to or book, then you're bound to identify which particular book. So in this particular case, this student used a lot of Ken Ham's books, and so she had to rely on the brief title of the text in her MLA endnote. And that's necessary and required when you have the author repeated more than one time. Okay, so that's just a little side note. But again, she should have had an MLA endnote for sentence 1 because it's a part of the content. And then, and again, she's talking about the Bible, and she's making a very declarative statement, what the whole Bible says. And it would be important to at least make one citation in that Bible that clearly is identifying that part. Endnotes are used to quantify, to qualify the substance of the statement with reference to where it came from. And anything of substance, any content of substance at all, you got somewhere from your research. That has to be tracked with a proper MLA endnote. Okay, now, one of the things I want you to look at this paragraph overall, she has a lot of real smooth flowing thoughts and sentences. She puts everything together in a very readable fashion, very, it's articulate, but it's also enjoyable, it's also readable. I'm not quite so concerned that your material is perfectly readable. I am concerned, though, that there's construction logic. You have to have a meaningful construction of ideas. You're beginning at this idea and you're flowing to an end idea with purpose, and so it's clear, and there's some semblance of flow. So one of the things that you're going to do as you're writing this body, once in a while, you're going to have to put in a brand new sentence that doesn't exist in your detailed outline, and it's going to have to be an introductory kind of topic sentence to bring focus to what this paragraph is going to be about. That introductory sentence may have some tangible reference back to the last idea, or you may tuck in at the end of the sentence, a sentence at the end of the paragraph, a particular sentence that helps you transition from one thought to the next. On this single page where the student has given some of the example of work here, these are excellent illustrations of smoothness, clarity, nice transition statements, and on occasion she writes an original sentence to make it flow. On another occasion, she takes something of substance in her content and she tucks that in there and uses it in a smooth, creative fashion to get the objective done. And what helps, though, if you look at the outline that she, I'm moving back a page just for a second. If you look at the outline page that is submitted here as an illustration, it's apparent that her essential outline has a structure of thought and flow. And she wanted to go through a process here. And her outline is sufficient. But when she transitions this outline into content, it's superb. It's a very readable paper. It's hitting the nail on the head. And then it works out in the end the way the paper ought to. Now let's go on to the next page, which goes back to the outline again. And I'm not quite sure. Oh, there it is. I have to do 2 clicks to get to X. There's an X over material items D through F. And that's to illustrate one comment, okay? These 3 points fit better at a different place in the paper. And she didn't realize it until she's trying to get this thing to write and to read in a manageable way, and she suddenly realizes that material doesn't fit there. She didn't cancel it from the paper, she moved it to an appropriate section. Now because we're just illustrating, I'm not going to pull the whole paper out and show you where she plugged it, but that's the kind of thoughtfulness that you have to give to your outline as you transition from an outline into a written document that is relying on the use of the essay format to communicate your information so the reader is taken from one thought to the next with clarity, there's a smoothness to it, and we don't have a problem understanding what are you trying to say or why are you trying to say it. Okay, let's look to the next page then. On the next page we have, I'm taking that paragraph apart a little bit, piece by piece, and we have a core sentence which was for her a very careful rewrite of a couple of those particular notes, and then she chose to use the MLA note to cover both of those topic points, and that's suitable, but it's a significant and thoughtful kind of sentence because she's trying to get the information across without overwhelming you with harsh detail. She's trying to smoothly get to the main objective of the point, and it's a good rewrite. Now, going on to the next page, we have just an additional underlining here of the top sentence. The introduction here has some substance in it, as I mentioned before, and again, it must have the citation. Then, when you get to she actually ends up underlining the last sentence as well. She has a core sentence too, but then she has a careful rewrite. Again, it's lacking at the end, though, a citation. She actually has substance and content in all these sentences, and so it required a proper end note, which she only has one of what I would require as far as 3. Now, that being in mind, I'm not going to take the time to do this because of class time, the limited nature. There's a little emphasis here, make your paper flow. That's the whole purpose of laboring over putting it into a written essay. Basically, if you were going to lecture, you would lecture from your detailed outline because the lecture is an oral essay. But when you're putting your essay into writing, then you take time to make it flow. It's a lot harder to reduce your paper in writing than it is to lecture from the notes and give a little bit of extra ad-lib as you go along. Now, again, back to the outline. The third point is focused on here. This is where her third paragraph would begin. You're going to have to go back to look at the paper. You can see the third paragraph beginning here on the bottom. She begins to move into that, and we're not going to go into detail with her third paragraph, but it just gives you a clear picture. You take the paper, segment at a time, analyze it, deal with it, and there's an element here that I just want to focus on. Where do you get your paragraphs from? And if a paragraph is supposed to be around 4 to 8 sentences max to minimum, then your outline should have subsections where you have these subsections of 4 to 8 points that you're dealing with. Okay, so in her outline, it's very tidy. She has the Roman numeral way at the top, definition and examples of compromise. That's the overriding section that she's dealing with. Then she has the subsections. A begins this, what is being compromised, and then subsection B, examples of compromise. So she has that broken into, but under the subsection A, what is being compromised, she has 3 primary points that she's dealing with. First, she's talking about the nature of evolution and how it affects compromise. Then she's talking about the nature of creation and the compromise. And she did some really excellent transitioning here to get those two thoughts smoothly flowing together, because her goal was to focus in on compromise, not in a whole bunch of detail about the nature of evolution or the nature of creation in this section. And then here in the third section, because her focal point is compromise, she's really taking a hard look at biblical foundations that are compromised when you carelessly review evolution from a secular viewpoint. So that's the intention. Now, what we don't have here, from the paper, just the next little point on your outline is just zeroing in on this was going to be her key point that she wanted to draw out of this foundation section. So she found it, and again, it's point C, it's not point A or B. And again, she's thoughtfully constructing the paper around that objective of getting that point across related to how the foundations are going to be destroyed if you're careless about the creation evolution issue. And so that's all of the student's paper that we're going to go into in terms of detail. But by way of recap, it's important that you understand, you start with the outline. And that outline is the structure of your research as it answers the research question that you asked. And the structure must be dealing with your question. The research hopefully dealt with your question. Now, I do want to spend time individually today reviewing your detailed outlines, because if you don't have a good detailed outline, you're going to have a hard time doing the paper. But it's important to see that as you use this outline and you move forward, there's a big difference between the outline and its structural appearance and how the paper begins to take form. We only have here scraps of 3 paragraphs in the first 3 paragraphs, and she removed some substantive content out of section 2 and put it somewhere else in the paper because it didn't fit in the basic flow of the paper, how she was bringing the topic up and where she was going. A comment about the first section of your paper. It's often true that the first section of your paper is foundational to the overall nature of the paper. To be foundational, you're probably going to do 2 things. What she chose to do is she chose to take a more surfacey approach of clearly framing the nature of the topic that she was after. And so it doesn't have a lot of heavy detail in this first section. It brings up the necessity of having good answers to that question. And then the rest of her paper was substantive and detail driven by the way the paper was written. The other possibility is your opening section requires a substantial amount of detail to get the foundation laid. It's all this detail that you're going to lay that you're going to utilize in the final arguments of your paper. So you've got to pay attention to your paper, to the logic of your thesis question. Did your research answer that thesis question? That's your thesis. And are you able to take that thesis and then, with your detailed outline, make a clear, logical presentation of all that information that you found, and then flip that outline, as it were, into a constructive essay that articulates basically your opinion of what the findings are and how they fit to answer the question of your topic. I will stop at this moment and take any questions that you might have at this point. Does anybody have a question, thinking especially just about this process of transitioning from your detailed outline to the essay? Anybody have a question? We need a question. Okay, well, we'll go on. Hopefully people on video don't have questions either. Second part of our lecture today, then, we're going to discuss how to arrange your paper. Now, I've tried to be as clear as possible in my handouts. You must ask me questions today if you have any problems. There's a fault with your handouts. Your handouts are in black and white, and when you look on the screen, you're going to see that I've been able to use some different colorings, so it's easier to view it on the screen. But let's go through it. Let's take time and answer questions. First sheet, okay? When you turn in your paper to me, the very first sheet is going to be this page, okay? And for the sake of the screen, what's not in red is the actual part of the first sheet. So if I should have made it so that this wasn't on there, but I can't. The first sheet basically has the proper title of the paper and the pertinent student information relating to what the paper is for, and it's laid out in the proper format. Now, here are several points, though, that I want to emphasize. I enlarged the font to make it easier to read on the screen, but it kind of screams at you on the paper. But there's no excuse to not get it, right? First point, all fonts need to be in Times New Roman or Times. Now, for your information, Times New Roman and Times are actually on the screen. And there's if you look at the word Times, you can see a tiny bit of difference. But there is no exception to that font, okay? If you have to go buy a typewriter that has that font in it, then you'll have to do that, okay? Every word processor has Times or Times New Roman, and you're required to have it in Times or Times New Roman, okay? The entire paper is to be double-spaced. That means the entire paper, okay? It's double-spaced because it's a student paper, and so it leaves room for teacher murder. Replace for red ink to flow? Okay. Number 3, make sure that the title on this title page is centered. It's in 14 point, and it's in bold font. Now listen carefully to where you have bold font and not, but I don't want bold font where it doesn't belong, but I don't want you to be missing your bold font when you're required. So it's centered, it's 14 point, size, that's called size in your little menu, size, it says 14 point. And then finally, it's bold. Now, next item, use proper heading capitalization. Proper heading capitalization generally means you always capitalize every word. The only real word that you don't capitalize is the word the, and sometimes people think that they can get away with not capitalizing is. Actually, is supposed to be capitalized. That's a mistake from the student. And the letter F here is not the same as the article the. And so and the can be left uncapitalized, but that's basically the only one. Use proper heading capitalization. Number 5, notice on the right-hand side, lower right-hand corner, you have the rest of the title page information. Now, all that's to be in 12 point and normal font. And when we say normal font, that's probably just a reference to your software. When you go up under menu and you have options, normal is no a fixation on the font. Then you have other options, bold, italic, underlined, etc. So normal eliminates italics, underline, it eliminates all the other things that you could have. You just have regular old typewriter font. So that's the nature of the article. Let's look at these other points here. You're going to have the name. You're going to have the date the paper is due. That's the date it's due on your homework assignment sheet, which is the expo date, I believe. It's going to be the requirement statement. What's this paper written in the satisfaction of? And the instructor name. Now, she doesn't have an instructor name on there, I guess, to protect her instructor that year. But that's my name. Do you know who I am? I'm Mr. Cox. If you don't know that yet, you can put that on your notes. Okay, so that's the first sheet. Now let's go to the second sheet. Now literally, this is the second sheet. I get your paper, the first sheet is that, and here's the second sheet. Now, the second sheet is the thesis question and the thesis outline, which we sort of used to be a table of contents, but you don't put page numbers on it, okay? So let's look at it from a big picture perspective. First of all, the thesis question is written at the top, and you sort of use it like a title, so you create center, justification, and there is a little mistake here in my notes. It's not only center justification, but it's bold, okay? Would you just please write that on there, indicate it, that it's bold. In fact, I'll be so kind and go into the program and write it if I can. All right. Get back to the slide here. That way everybody gets the same thing. Bold. I like to shout things. Okay. Second point Notice that I have two more notations. There's Roman numerals and there's capital letters. This is getting back to your original thesis outline. Comment. If your original thesis outline got revised in the course of finishing your paper, please do not submit your original thesis outline here. I don't want your original thesis outline. I want the outline that you utilized. I need to be able to find a direct correlation between all of these headings in your paper. And if you miss it here, then you'll probably miss it in your paper, okay? So, and this is going to be a helpful organizer for you, okay? First of all, I comment Roman numerals, Roman numeral points, okay? When you have your thesis outline, you change that into your detailed outline, but your detailed outline and your thesis outline need to have the exact same Roman numeral points written in the exact same fashion, okay? Now that means that as you wrote your detailed outline and refined your detailed outline and changed your Roman numeral points to either read better or to work differently, then you're obligated to go back into the thesis outline and change the thesis outline so that it's a one-to-one correspondence, okay? I do not want different Roman numeral ones here in the content outline and then look at your paper and you got totally different Roman numeral outline points. I mean, this is your table of contents, and it really helps me, but here's the problem for you. Since it helps me, if it's missing, it really hurts you, because this is the little mechanism. I quickly can review your paper, and when you're lacking clarity at this point, your whole paper starts to show up lacking clarity, and it is, it actually, in the long run, will mark your grade down, potentially in a substantial way. So you have Roman numeral points. A couple of things about the Roman numeral points. All your Roman numeral points in the outline will be 14 points. That's the size, and bold, okay? And what you're going to have here in the table of contents, you're going to have in the content of the paper, okay? So it's a one-to-one correspondence. Whatever's here, in fact, if it was me, you make your good thesis outline, then when you're making your paper, you just come in here and you copy that and paste it in your paper as you're flying through it, okay? So that's your Roman numeral points. So it reads, now notice, on the paper, there are no Roman numerals, okay? I do not want to see one Roman numeral in your paper, okay? The outline is used to help you get structure, but when you get to this point, we can read. This is your first point, this is your second point, this is your third point, and it turns it into an essay section, okay? Now the second thing to note out is the capital letters. All of your capital letter points in your thesis outline are shown here in your final thesis outline, which serves as your table of contents, okay? Now here's the point, again. As you write your final detailed outline and you vary and change these capital letter points, then this will reflect it exactly. Again, it's one-to-one correspondence. Here, notice that the capital letters are going to be 14 point, not bold, italics, okay? Now you're going to transpose this structure into the paper. There's only one little alteration that's going to occur, that one of these is going to be centered, that's your Roman numeral points, and the other one's going to be left justified, that's your capital letter points. But what happens is this this thesis outline up front gives the reader, and of course the most important reader is me, a quick view of what your paper is supposed to be and a quick sense of how to go through the paper. The next thing that I do after I read this is I go through your paper and get a feel for the flow. And I can speed read when I do that, and I can in about 30 seconds recognize whether your paper is on target or it's went to the moon and nobody came back with it yet. Okay, so this is a very helpful section. Page 2, there it is. Thesis question, thesis outline. One-to-one correspondence, question.
Yes. Shouldn't the of be capitalized?
Shouldn't the what?
Examples of compromise.
Let me look at the paper here. Shouldn't what be capitalized?
The of.
I'm sorry, where are we?
On the definitions of examples of compromise. First.
It says example.
Numeral.
Yeah.
Right.
You said something about capitalizing.
Yeah. In this particular subsection here, this isn't the main title of your whole paper, but you use the titling format. My opinion is some of these filler words can be left. I'm not going to mark you off if they're not. If you want to know my opinion, it should be capitalized. But I actually am not going to mark it off. This one, but I might, if I notice it, you'll notice it. By the way, just a comment about what I notice. When you get your work back from me, you'll see red. Now, once you dry your tears, then you work through the details. Don't lose that copy, okay? I don't have a genius memory. I can't remember everything. And here's what happens. If you don't return, when you return your papers to me, you always return the old copy with it. Why? So I can remember what I said to you. I promise you one thing. If I missed something that I should have said to you, I won't take it off from you in the final analysis, with the assumption that it was something that was not obviously egregious, like, you only got 12 pages, In the end, if you don't have 15 pages, you don't have a paper. But when I look at something the second time, because you remodeled it, because you finished it, it presents itself differently, and I notice things differently, so I might notice some new stuff. But to be fair, that rough draft correction that I give you, that's what I want you to correct, and correct other things if you notice them, but then when you return your second or final draft, give me back the original marking so I can be clear what am I looking for that you needed to fix and finish. Okay? Now, so that was a good question. Any other questions? Yes?
What size font should the, I guess that would be the thesis question, right? Yeah. Right.
Okay, what size font should this thesis question be? Thank you for asking. 14 point. Well, I just didn't have that heading right, did I? 14 point, bold, and proper. Now notice though that this is not in caps, okay? This is a sentence, and so it's just written in bold. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Why is the thesis question bigger than the outline? And they're all the same size. I mean, they're all.
Why are you so sharp in your viewing of things?
Well,
I didn't notice that. That's why it is. This student's paper evidently had not 14 point, but like 16 or 18. I don't ever want more than 14 point in the paper.
Okay.
So she didn't get it marked down. I would have cut her grade down to size. Okay, third sheet. Okay, literally third sheet. Okay, the third sheet of your paper begins in this fashion, and I want to make some clarity to you so you don't die before the next assignment. Notice that the thesis statement is in bold, and it begins the paper. There's no marking saying this is the thesis statement. It's just plugged in there, okay? That's kind of an artificial way to plug the thesis statement in, but it's a tool that I personally use to force you into recognizing that as I read your whole paper, I need to be able to identify that thesis statement in a concise and a clear flowing fashion. Your outline needs to correlate to this. Let me go back to the nature of the outline here, okay? And in this case, please listen to what I'm saying, because if what you're looking at is a little off, remember it was a student's work, wasn't mine. Mine would have been perfect. Just kidding, just kidding. Hurry up, okay. See these Roman numeral points here? Okay? This represents 3 substantive finds from the research. Okay? So when you go to the thesis statement, those 3 things need to be in some way or shape or form referenced, pointed out. Now, the smoother the statement is, the more discreet that they're found. But, and overlook her thesis statement if it doesn't seem to be as clear to you, because if I remember correctly, this thesis statement I didn't like. Now, here's the point. Again, there's a forcing of you to go through an exercise of a logical answer to a logical question by having had careful research and then assimilating that research and presenting a finding, okay? So what your thesis statement is, it's the briefest statement of your findings. And the briefest statement of your findings ought to be able to encompass the main sections of your paper. So if you have 3 sections to your paper, those 3 sections need to be articulated in that thesis statement. Now, I'll actually give you credit for a wooden thesis statement. What's a wooden thesis statement? One that has all the 3 items for your, or 4 items for your Roman numeral points, but it's kind of rough and not real smooth. I'll give you full credit for your thesis statement, just if you have those. Sometimes people have real polished thesis statement, but when all they're done, they don't have the thesis in there. They don't give me the information that I'm looking for. So, and that's important, because when you go on to your introduction, which will be the next lecture, February 2nd, is it February 2nd? Well, the next class, whenever it is. I think it's my history classes. Just have you guys show up for history class. Great. So that thesis statement is also reflected in your introduction. If you have 3 points, you should have 3 paragraphs in your introduction. Okay? Because the introduction is kind of just giving you a quick overview of the whole paper, and it's like the thesis statement just tells you, these are the main points I'm going after. The introduction kind of gives you a brief overview of it. Now, that's an important statement about the introduction. However, I do want to underline, in the structural flow of this course, you do not have to have your introduction written by next class, okay? You do have to provide paper for it. So when you turn in your paper, you'll have thesis statement, and you'll have the word introduction, and then you'll have a blank. Now, I'm not going to penalize you if you put some introduction in there, but you don't have to have introduction written. It's not part of the next class, but you do have to provide the place for it. So that's the 3rd page, okay? 1, 2, 3. These first 3 pages look what they are. Bold left justification, 14 point for your thesis statement. Make sure that you have 2 extra, she calls them enters, just returns. It's two spaces, okay? You're doubling space, you're double spacing, okay? So that's always true. But when it says 2 extra enters, you're basically going to have 6 spaces between. That provides the space, okay? The title of each major section is bold, and it's 14 point. Now, the introduction and the conclusion are the only 2 that are not in your outline. It doesn't appear in your outline, but they're the lead and the end. For the purpose of your paper, of your homework assignment due, I want you to have the introduction there and provide some space for it, but it's not going to be completed or reviewed. And then, of course, the balance of the paper is the normal font at 12 point. Here's a biggie, okay? I do not want anything more than 1-inch margins. That's everywhere, all the way around, okay? Believe it or not, it's creative students who say, I don't have enough material, that expand their material to fit the paper by changing the size of the margins. I can tell. And it's kind of embarrassing to have to write your paper over at the last minute. Okay, so I think that was, okay, that was everything. All right. Now, here's some additional concerns to pay attention to. Once, you could say that this just begins the rest of your paper, okay? I went through the first specific pages. Now we're going through the rest of the paper. Here's how the rest of the paper should look, okay? Let me back up, though, because I don't think you quite caught the transition. Okay? Notice that the big margin word says 3rd sheet, 1st page. Did you catch that? Your 3rd sheet is your 1st page. And you say, that's not mathematically possible. I tell you it is. I'm the teacher. Okay? It's the 1st page of your actual paper. It's the 1st page that counts towards your 15 pages. That's what that means, okay? And if it's the 1st page that counts, then what you do is, this is the paper format. You have your thesis statement, you have your first section heading, and then you begin writing your introduction as appropriate using the system here. All center titles are bold 14 point, all margins are 1 inch, all text is 12 point normal font. But then immediately following the 3rd page for the rest of the paper, this is your format, okay? You're going to have, on the right-hand side, you're going to do page numbering with the top right-hand margin. Now, notice that this particular student put her initials next to the page. That is considered appropriate, and I would expect you, I don't have a little note writing that out, but I want you to pay attention. You would put your first name as an initial, with a period, and then your last name. And you start numbering with page 2. Now, this is going to put a cramp in some of your computer's style, okay? Because if you say number, some of your computers are going to start numbering with page 1. So you either have to pay attention to your software and say begin numbering on page 1 with number 2. You can command a lot of software to do that. That's what you do here. Then it'll automatically number the rest of the time for you. If it doesn't do it automatically, you'll have to do it manually, okay? But I do not want a page number on any page till we get to the 4th page. And the 4th page number is 2, okay? Because that's the content. 2nd page of your content. Now, beyond that, again, yes, question, thank you.
No page number on the first page? You don't
The
want-
first 3 pages have no page number, thank you. None. The first page of your paper, which is the 3rd page of your paper, that's the first page of your actual paper. I know it's the first page and you don't need to put number 1 on it, okay? You start with number 2, page 2, and you follow this format basically the rest of the paper. This is an important page to memorize because it applies to all the rest of the pages. Numbering up at the right. This first one is start with number 2, and then the subsequent ones can continue in a proper sequence. Always end your last sentence of the prior section with 1 extra space before you do a new heading. Okay? Just breaks it. That's a very important visual break. Now, by extra section, I'm meaning these Roman numeral sections that are identified here. This is a center, bold, 14-point section. That's your headings. That's from your Roman numeral outlines. For these central headings, you'll have all of the Roman numeral headings from your thesis outline. If you have 5, you'll have 5 of those. Plus those 5, you'll have 1 for introduction before, and at the end, 1 for conclusion at the end. Is that a question? Also, notice that the subheadings for capital letters begins with your italics. This is also 14-point. It's taken again right from the table of contents. But notice that it's left-hand justified as a subsection, so that when your paper reads, I can quickly see, okay, this is a new section, it's covering this topic. This is part 1 of that new section, and then each paragraph under that is the specific information that relates to that particular section in that particular fashion. Okay? Are there any questions on this? Now, your paper will continue until you complete it. However, at some point in time, you'll get to the end of your paper. Question?
About the introduction, how long should it be?
Okay, thank you for asking. We're going to have a class completely dedicated to introduction and conclusion. That's the next class. Okay, so I'm not expecting you to write the introduction and conclusion for this first draft. I will say that the introduction and conclusion recaps your main Roman numeral points, and so you usually have 1 paragraph per section, and that kind of contributes how long it is. So if you have 5 sections, of basically 5 paragraphs, 3 sections, basically 3 paragraphs. Okay. Now, when you get to the end, what happens is you'll finish your paper. Actually, let me insert here. There's a mistake. I should have showed you the page before this, illustrating your conclusion. So I just want to tell you orally. Now, you don't have to write the conclusion, but at the end of your paper, go ahead and provide space for your conclusion. So you'll provide a centered, 14-point, bold title that says conclusion, and you'll have nothing under it because you're not going to write the conclusion at this point. At least you're not required to. And then after that page comes what's called the second to the last page, or the Work Cited page. Now, actually, I say second to the last. If you happen to need 2 pages for this, well then that's second and third pages to the last. Okay, it's the last thing that you have before the last page. Now, this is a little bit difficult to read, and it's not important, but I think if you look closely, you can sort of read it, and it was done in the right fashion. Here's a little bit of a summary. Make sure that your works cited are listed in alphabetical order. In the first word of each listing is what you use the alphabetical listing for, okay? Now, I would like to just zero in on one of these listings and blow it up for you for a little bit of detail. This is one listing from the works cited, drawn out of the middle of it. And I'd like to go over it real briefly to just show you the issues. Number one, you're going to put the author's last name first. Number two, well, that was really nice. Everything else appears. Number two, you're going to put the author's first name last. Okay? I know that sounds confusing, so read the notes. Thirdly, the title of the book or work that you're quoting from or you're using will be underlined. Okay? Number four, you're going to include the publisher's name as you would find it on the binding of the book or whatever. You're also going to include the publisher's address, the city and state part of the address, and you're also going to include the copyright date, which is the original date of writing. And so that represents a basic listing for your works cited page. The last sheet is the hardest sheet of the whole paper. It's blank. Now, it's supposed to be there. That's where I like to draw pictures and make faces at you and tell you how terrible you did on your paper. So that's your last page. Are there any questions? Yes?
For the works cited, what do you do if you have a magazine or an internet site?
Okay. At this particular point, I don't have that precise information, so if I try to tell you, I'm going to blow it. Okay? So just to refer you back. In your book that you've been using, it clearly describes it in there, and in the section that we went over that in your notes, there's some clear examples and notations. Essentially, always remember this rule when you're citing anything strange. Ask yourself the question, how can I find this again if I need to go back and find it? And the information in your citation is that kind of information that helps you to find it again. Okay? So, but for the internet, we have quite a detailed description of that. I prefer you just go back to your notes because I can't accurately remember it today without getting everybody in trouble, changing the rules in midstream. Okay, a little final note on referencing. I know I discussed this earlier, but I'll just recap here on referencing the endnotes. We're going to be using the MLA parenthetical format. That means you're going to use parentheses at the end of a sentence. Most sentences should be sentences of substance and need to be referenced. And I went over that in quite detail with some of the illustration in the class that we had. Thirdly, make sure that you include the author's last name, followed by the page number, no comma. Notice that's a proper MLA endnote reference. I just want to remind you, though, in the lecture today, I pointed out if you have the same author and more than one work, then you have to put a comma and you have to cite the title of the work so that people know which book you're talking about. And then lastly, I have a little arrow pointing that you always put your punctuation after the reference. So you have the sentence, you space, you put your parentheses, make your MLA endnote, close the parentheses, add your punctuation. And that's universal. I do not want those MLA notes standing alone into the next sentence. Tuck it inside the punctuation. Are there any questions on the MLA endnote referencing system that we're using? Next meeting. This is what's due. Now you're obligated to look at the calendar, okay? I don't remember exactly. I can only remember that February 2nd is the history class, so it's probably 1 week before that. But anyway, regardless, this is what I want. I want you to have a typed copy of your first draft. And I don't mind if you don't use a typewriter. If you want to use a computer and print it off, that's fine. Make sure that it's complete with the title page, your thesis outline, which is your table of contents, the thesis question page, those are pages 1, 2, 3, and page 4, which begins the thesis statement introduction page, properly numbered, make sure that you provide also a conclusion section. Now notice it says conclusion section because you're not going to write the conclusion yet. And I also noted up here, thesis statement, introduction page. You don't have to have the introduction written. And then lastly, just a little reminder, make sure your paper flows from one paragraph to the next and from one section to the next. It should read smoothly. Nobody should get lost wondering what you're talking about and how you got to where you are in the paper. Are there any questions? Any questions? Now, Nancy, at this point we're finished with the lecture. However, don't turn me off. I would like to butcher one student publicly. We have a volunteer.
Mine really needs help, so I think I'd rather.
You think yours really needs help? Well, that could be really nice to have somebody that needs help. All right. Are there any other volunteers for butchering? Come on. If it really needs help, that means that it'll really be good for everybody. We can learn from things that need help. I saw words on paper. That's important. And I'll need to try to, actually, I'll just back this up one. I'll be nice.
Yeah.
It's not possible for me to be mean, is it?
I'll hang that for you.
Well, if it has to be her paper, she doesn't want to be seen on the screen. It's her paper. Okay. Now, I'm just going to treat this like I would if I'm grading, and I'm going to do it out loud, and it's for the benefit of people who aren't here also. I'm looking at the detailed outline, and I see Roman numeral 1. I'm scanning, 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 I'm scanning. She only has one Roman numeral. She's going to do the whole paper of the first section. Now, I have a question. Is this incomplete?
That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, it's not complete. Okay.
I had surgery and I really.
Listen, nobody's going to execute you, but I have one Roman numeral. I will say this. If you turn your final detailed outline in with only one Roman numeral, it'll be wrong. Okay? Now, the second point is, under this one Roman numeral, what are the subpoints? I have a capital letter A, capital letter B, capital letter C, capital letter D, capital letter E, capital letter E. Okay. Now, so that's not bad per se. Obviously, I don't have all our cards, and I don't have the rest of the outline to look at it. But here's where I really start to cringe. Okay? Assuming that the subsection, capital letter A, is going to be a discussion about that primary topic, and I'll just read it for the sake of clarity. Does the portrait of biblical womanhood change? Now, that's the basic question she's going to be answering now. Now, underneath that, what I'm looking for is, what's your next break point? Well, this is what she has, okay? She has a numeral 1, 2, 3. Now, in numeral 1, 2, and 3, she has, under Roman numeral 1, she has 5 points. Under Roman numeral 2, no, I didn't read that right. Under Roman numeral 1, I'm going to have to write on with a pen. Under Roman numeral 1, she has 11 points. Under Roman numeral 2, she has 6 points. And under Roman numeral, under numeral 3, numeral 3, she has 7 points. Now let me ask a question. Is that balanced? 11, 7, and 7. Is that balanced? 11 kind of starts pushing past the 8. You want to have between 4 to 8 usually, substantive points of reference. So I'm asking a question, what is it in this section that is potentially either needs to be dropped or combined or can it stand? You know, there are occasions when the paper can take a little more information, but we want to have a little bit of balance, and it's just a tad off balance. Now, but here's the real problem. That's the only balance section she has. So when we move on to the next section, B, and we go under numeral 1, she has one, well, she has small letter A through U. That's almost the whole alphabet. So that's not breaking it down. Basically, she has almost 2 whole pages of information. So we probably need that broken down a little farther. Then in numeral 2, she has A through H, which is 8, which is kind of in that guideline of, substantive. And then the numerical number 3, she has all the way to T. So is that balanced? My opinion is it's not only not balanced, it's starting to get extremely imbalanced. Now, I'm not looking at your content per se at this point to judge where your problem is. But what I would like to say is it's possible that you're beginning to write an extremely long paper with an enormous amount of substance. And if I look at this and get a picture of where you're headed, I'm wondering if we're going to have 39, 49 pages that you're all done with, And it's not really bad that you do that. We didn't require that much, but it starts to change texture from this minimal essay, this minimal research paper, to a more substantial work that may have substance. But really, even if you like the content under your main heading, you need to recognize that your small little points, small letter A through whatever, each one of that grouping is pretty much supposed to be a paragraph. And doesn't matter what work you have, if you have a paragraph, well, let's put it this way. I'm looking at an outline that covers several pages, 2.5 pages for one point. That's going to translate into a paragraph that long. And if nothing else, it's going to be too hard to read. So you need to break down your content a little bit more substantively so that there's a little bit more flow. What happens is, and I don't know, is it repetitious? Is it a lot of different information accidentally put in the same section and it could be broken out easily? You have to look at it and start thinking, why do you have it there? What's important about it? What are you trying to say? And rethink it, because you may have to just drop some of the information. You don't need to be repetitive. It's only a 15-page paper. And I don't mind if you have a longer than 15-page paper. But you have to think in terms of, when you read that paper, I ought to be able to see paragraphing on every page. That's a rule of thumb. For me to pick up any page that just has continuous words with no break, I'm dyslexic and I lose my way. So help the reader follow through your point of logic. Interestingly enough, if you don't have some of this structure and proper paragraphing, it makes it very difficult for anybody to read it, and so it's not likely somebody will read it. But if you have the breakouts and the little points of clarity as you go along, then what happens is you draw the reader in, and they can read it much more rapidly, but they're more likely to stick with it through the whole paper. But by going over this paper, for the record, I want to make one more comment. My illustrations today focused on the assumption that you weren't going to be real deep in your outline. Your paper, it looks like, is going to be a little deeper than what we went over. So I would like to add one point of clarification. Look at this second sheet of your paper, which is the thesis outline. And this gives you the headings. This is your main section headings. They're centered, they're bold, they're drawing attention to the main topic that you're covering in that section. And then underneath it you have these subpoints to that section, okay? You're not going to change your thesis outline, you're not going to change it at all, but when you have a subsection like hers that has some significant amount of information in it, you're actually going to have in your paper a need to identify what those subsections are. And so here's how I'd like you to identify it. It's going to be mandatory for your paper, I think, just looking at what you have so far. What you're going to need is, you need to take the very first sentence of the paragraph, and you need to underline either a key phrase that you lead in with, or underline the whole sentence. And that key phrase or key sentence gives you the structure of those subpoints. So in her case, she has Roman numeral 1, okay? Then she has capital letter A, and then she has, it's not on the outline and it's not going to be on the outline, then she has small letter 1, okay? Then under small letter 1, she has an enormous amount of information that is going to be 1 or 2 paragraphs in itself. And so with that small numeral 1, she's going to want to catch that section that she's dealing with some kind of a specific reference clarity on the paper. What I like you to do is that first sentence is underlined. And so it draws attention to the continuing flow of structure, okay? And then the rest of the breakdowns are the paragraphs. So when you have a lengthy section and it's going to have more than 1 paragraph, often you're going to need to revert to that. And in the process that we go on, let me just assure you one thing. Once you get your paper in, I'll look over it and give some basic critiquing and correction of it. Pay attention to it, but I'll point out to you if your paper is too cluttered and impossible to read and needs a little bit more articulation by breaking down the visible paper as you go through it. Okay, thank you for allowing me to go over your paper. Are there any other questions from anyone? Okay, at this point, the class is ended, and what I'd like to do is, besides turning off